December 1941. The Pacific erupted in flames. From Hawaii to Hong Kong, from the Philippines to Malaya. The sun that rose over Japan's empire now cast its glare upon a world at war. For the soldiers and commanders of the Imperial Army, it was the dawn of destiny. The fulfillment of a dream long whispered in barracks and schools. Japan would prove itself superior to the West. Behind every salute and shouted "Banzai" lay an invisible code older than gunpowder. Bushido, the way of the warrior. To these men, surrender was more than weakness. It was erasure. A soldier who yielded his sword lost his honor, his family's respect, and his claim to exist. Captivity was spiritual suicide. They were taught from the moment they wore a uniform that mercy was something to be granted downward, from victor to vanquished, never upward, never returned. The Japanese officer was expected to die standing, not kneel and beg. The Western concept of the laws of war, of treaties and conventions meant to civilize conflict, struck them as absurd. Japan had declined to ratify the 1929 Geneva Convention on the treatment of prisoners of war, though its diplomats had attended the talks. To Tokyo's generals, such agreements belonged to soft nations with soft soldiers. One War Ministry official reportedly dismissed the entire document with a smirk. If you must write rules for war, you no longer understand war. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, Japan's high command was convinced of its moral superiority. They would fight cleanly, decisively, honorably, but not mercifully. They saw American talk of rights and humanitarian codes as the delusions of a people unwilling to suffer. The Americans might have laws, but Japan had discipline, spirit, and sacrifice. As Imperial troops swept across the Pacific in early 1942, their commanders' contempt for the enemy hardened into cruelty. At Singapore, Hong Kong, and the Philippines, Allied forces were captured by the tens of thousands. They were men who had fought bravely but were broken by starvation and lack of ammunition. To the Japanese, this confirmed what they already believed. Western soldiers lacked honor. In propaganda broadcasts, captured Americans were called men who fought for comfort. At the Bataan Peninsula, more than 70,000 prisoners began a forced trek under a blazing sun, 60 miles on foot with no food or water. Those who stumbled were shot, bayoneted, or left in ditches. The event became known to the world as the Bataan Death March. Japanese guards justified the brutality through their own ideology. A prisoner was beneath human dignity, undeserving of compassion. To feed him was to waste rations. To ease his suffering was to insult those who had died in battle. Within their culture, this was logic, not cruelty. But to the rest of the world, it was savagery. Back in Washington, stunned officials read reports that defied comprehension. Survivors spoke of men dying standing up, eyes glazed, too weak to fall. Yet even as the United States raged, it reaffirmed its commitment to the Geneva Convention. To abandon it would mean to become what it fought. For the Japanese command, this American obsession with moral law became a running joke. Officers mocked the idea of civilized war, a contradiction, they said, as absurd as peaceful murder. To them, the world would belong not to the lawful, but to the ruthless. But history would reverse the equation. As the war dragged on, Japan's faith in spirit began to clash with the reality of steel. America's factories turned out ships faster than Japan could sink them. Bombers filled the sky, submarines prowled the seas, and by 1944, the empire's perimeter cracked. The same commanders who had ridiculed Western rules now faced the unthinkable: defeat. For men trained to see surrender as dishonor, there was no vocabulary for losing. They clung to their code, even as their nation burned. Yet a paradox was forming, one invisible in the smoke of war. The laws they mocked, the ones they called weakness, would one day be their salvation. While Japan's armies conquered through fear, the United States prepared to win through law. The Geneva Convention of 1929, born from the ashes of the First World War, was more than paper. It was civilization's shield against itself. It bound nations to treat prisoners not as spoils, but as human beings. American soldiers were instructed from training onward that if captured, they had rights: food, shelter, medical care, and if they took prisoners, they were duty-bound to uphold those same standards. The War Department printed pocket guides explaining how to handle POWs humanely. For the U.S., adherence to Geneva wasn't just morality, it was identity. President Roosevelt and his advisors believed that moral consistency was the Republic's greatest weapon. The enemy could burn cities and enslave nations, but America would show that power constrained by principle was stronger than power without conscience. The policy had enemies at home. Some generals demanded retribution for Bataan, but Roosevelt refused. "We will not sink to their level," he said. Throughout 1942 and 1943, as Allied POWs languished in jungle camps, Japanese prisoners began trickling into American hands. Many refused to believe they would live long. Some tried to provoke guards into shooting them, preferring death to the shame of captivity. But the Americans did not oblige. They documented each man's identity, gave him food, and even allowed correspondence through the Red Cross. In places like Hawaii, Guam, and Australia, the first Japanese POW camps were established. Rations were meager by American standards, but generous compared to what Japanese soldiers received at the front. Medical officers treated malaria, frostbite, and gunshot wounds. Translators explained the camp rules, all based on Geneva's articles. At first, the prisoners thought it was a trick. Their propaganda had promised that Americans would mutilate captives. Instead, they were offered soap and cigarettes. One soldier later wrote, "I felt as if I had died and come to a world that had forgotten how to hate." Meanwhile, U.S. propaganda made little of these acts. They were not performed for glory. They were simply law, the quiet, stubborn kind of morality that endures without applause. By 1944, this legal backbone had become America's moral advantage. In Europe, German POWs were treated well, often better than local farmhands. In the Pacific, the same standard held. The Army's Judge Advocate General's office reminded officers that how they handled prisoners would shape post-war justice. "The world is watching," one memo warned. Indeed, it was. Japanese commanders had once scoffed at the idea of such scrutiny, but the day was coming when they would stand under that very gaze. As the Allied advance closed around Japan, the contrast between the two systems, the lawless and the lawful, became impossible to ignore. Japan's empire was sustained by terror, America's war machine by discipline. The moral gap widened with every island retaken. When Manila was liberated in 1945, reporters found evidence of mass executions and torture. American newspapers printed the photographs. The outrage was universal. Yet the government's stance did not change. No mass reprisals, no public hangings without trial. Even as firebombs gutted Tokyo, the principle remained. The rules of humanity apply, even to those who defy them. And so, when Japan finally surrendered, the United States was ready, not only to occupy a defeated land, but to demonstrate what civilization looked like in victory. The final year of the war exposed the full madness of Japan's military creed. On Saipan, civilians leapt from cliffs rather than be captured. On Okinawa, soldiers fought until only the wounded remained. The code of death before dishonor had become national suicide. By the summer of 1945, Japan's navy was annihilated, its cities reduced to ashes, its people starving. Yet the generals still clung to delusion. In briefings, they spoke of mobilizing schoolboys and farmers with bamboo spears. "We will make every hill a fortress," they promised. Then came August 6th. Hiroshima vanished in a white flash. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. The weapons that ended worlds ended theirs. When Emperor Hirohito's voice reached his subjects on August 15, it was as if the divine had confessed mortality. His speech was poetic, but its meaning was simple. Japan would surrender. For the first time, the empire's warriors faced the impossible. To obey meant to live, and to live meant to bear shame. All across Asia and the Pacific, Japanese units laid down their arms. Some officers committed ritual suicide. Others burned regimental flags and waited for the enemy they had once called beasts. Allied troops approached cautiously, expecting ambushes. Instead, they found silence. Men kneeling in rows, rifles stacked neatly beside them. The surrender was total. Nearly 500,000 Japanese soldiers became prisoners of the Allies. They were shipped to camps in Guam, the Philippines, Australia, and the United States. For many, it was the first time they tasted white bread or drank coffee. At first, disbelief ruled. Captives whispered that torture was coming, that the Americans were only pretending kindness before execution. But the executions never came. They were registered, examined, fed, and issued clean clothing. The process was orderly, almost courteous. One former captain later said, "We waited for revenge, but they gave us blankets." The irony was staggering. Men who had denied humanity to others were now alive because their enemies refused to imitate them. In the months after surrender, the Geneva Convention came alive in ways Japan had never imagined. American officers, determined to prove moral superiority, ran their camps with precision. The prisoners called them fair enemies. At the Guam detention centers, officers who once commanded death marches now stood in line for soup under U.S. sergeants half their age. Some stared at their bowls in disbelief. Others bowed before eating, unable to reconcile the act of receiving charity from those they had condemned as barbarians. Doctors treated ulcers, malaria, and malnutrition without discrimination. The Red Cross inspected camps regularly, ensuring rations met the standards of the very treaty Japan had ignored. Letters moved across the ocean under Allied censorship, reaching mothers who had long assumed their sons were dead. Slowly, the psychological shift began. Japanese prisoners who had spent years calling mercy weakness now experienced it daily. Their worldview cracked. They saw American guards reprimanded for mistreating them, heard chaplains preaching forgiveness instead of vengeance. A few began to question what their empire had stood for. Not all accepted it. Some officers withdrew into silence, unable to bear humiliation. A colonel in Guam attempted to starve himself to death. An American medic sat by his cot for days until he relented. "You are alive," the medic told him. "That is victory enough." The quiet humanity of their captors did what propaganda could not. It exposed the lie of Japanese superiority. Former imperial officers began recording their experiences in journals, astonished that their conquerors respected laws they had mocked. By early 1946, the transformation was visible. Japanese POWs in Australia farmed vegetables. Others in the Philippines repaired roads and schools. They were still prisoners, but they were alive. And that simple fact carried a lesson greater than any sermon. They had believed law was weakness. Now, law had become grace. By the winter of 1945, the camps were orderly, almost quiet. Outside their fences, Japan lay in ruins. Inside, the rule of law persisted with deliberate calm. Yet across the Allied world, anger still burned. Photos of the dead from Bataan and Burma appeared in newspapers. Congressmen demanded revenge. "They gave our men starvation," one editorial declared. "Give them the same." But Washington held firm. The War Department issued a directive. Japanese prisoners were to remain under full Geneva protection. The principle that had guided America through war would guide it through victory. If civilization faltered in triumph, then the entire struggle had been meaningless. In Manila, the first war crimes tribunals opened even as rebuilding began. American lawyers compiled evidence with the rigor of accountants. They documented names, dates, medical records. Each case would be proven, not proclaimed. There would be no lynchings, no mob justice. The world would see due process where tyranny had shown only violence. For months, teams of investigators interviewed witnesses and survivors from hundreds of Japanese camps. Diaries were translated, mass graves exhumed, death certificates traced. The meticulous work astonished journalists accustomed to chaos. One British correspondent wrote, "The Allies are building the gallows plank by plank, and they measure every nail." In Tokyo, preparations began for the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the so-called Tokyo Trials. 28 of Japan's top leaders were indicted: generals, admirals, politicians, propagandists. The court was multinational, staffed by judges from 11 nations. Proceedings would be public, transparent, and exhaustive. Every accused man would have counsel and the right to speak. Inside the Allied camps, prisoners waited uneasily. Rumors spread that executions were imminent, that mercy had run its course. Then came the unexpected news. Even accused war criminals would receive doctors, defense lawyers, and translators. The very laws they had ridiculed were protecting them. A former staff officer captured in Burma wrote home, "The Americans fight us with paper instead of bullets, and paper is stronger." When the trials opened in May 1946, the accused entered the courtroom wearing pressed suits instead of shackles. Each bowed to the judges, then sat silently as a U.S. clerk read the charges. Murder, torture, enslavement, crimes against humanity. In the gallery sat correspondents from around the world, sketching the faces of men who had once commanded millions. The prosecution played film of liberated camps, skeletal figures behind barbed wire, piles of bones near railway embankments. Some defendants wept, others stared blankly. General Yamashita Tomoyuki, the Tiger of Malaya, insisted that subordinates had acted without orders. The court ruled otherwise. His execution, carried out by firing squad after a full appeal, marked the beginning of a new principle. Commanders would be held responsible for crimes they failed to prevent. Even then, the Americans resisted spectacle. No public hangings, no desecration. The condemned were buried according to procedure, their names recorded. The law remained sterile, professional, a triumph of restraint over wrath. Observers recognized the irony. The victor's discipline shamed the defeated more deeply than cruelty ever could. For many Japanese officers still in custody, this legal theater became an education. They watched the same Americans who had burned their cities insist on giving them translators, transcripts, and medical care. One noted in his diary, "They are terrible in war, but in peace they are almost gentle." Perhaps that is strength. By the end of 1948, the major trials concluded. 7 men were executed. 16 received life sentences, others lesser terms. Justice, measured not by revenge, but by law, had been delivered. And through it all, the Geneva Convention, once a foreign abstraction, had guided every procedure. While judges pronounced sentences in Tokyo, life continued inside the camps scattered from Guam to Australia. The seasons rolled by with monotonous discipline. Roll call, meals, work, study, lights out. Yet beneath the routine, something profound was happening. The prisoners were changing. In one camp outside Manila, American instructors organized literacy classes. Former Japanese sergeants learned English using discarded army manuals. A few even joined religious services led by chaplains who had survived Japanese imprisonment themselves. The quiet symmetry of those meetings, victim and captor kneeling in the same tent, spoke louder than sermons. As months passed, repatriation began. Men who had once commanded divisions now lined up for transport ships home. They carried issued clothing, small pay packets, and Red Cross identification cards. Before departure, each received medical checks and rations for the voyage. One last act of procedure by a bureaucracy that refused to hate. When the ships docked in Japan, families waited at piers beside heaps of rubble that had once been cities. Some wives fainted at the sight of husbands they had presumed dead. Many soldiers returned silently, bowing to American officers before disembarking. The homecoming was bittersweet. They were alive, but the empire they fought for was gone. The Japanese press covered these arrivals cautiously. The American Occupation Authority encouraged truth, but not humiliation. Stories emphasized recovery and reconstruction, not vengeance. And in villages across the country, returned POWs told their neighbors astonishing tales of fair treatment, of doctors who saved lives, of guards who obeyed rules. Listeners at first dismissed them as propaganda, but as more men confirmed the same accounts, disbelief gave way to uneasy admiration. That narrative slowly reshaped post-war culture. The notion that law could coexist with honor, that compassion could emerge from strength, began to influence teachers, writers, and reformers. Universities introduced courses on international relations. Newspapers quoted the Geneva Principles that had spared so many. A word that once implied weakness, jinkin, human rights, entered mainstream vocabulary. In 1947, Japan adopted a new constitution under Allied supervision. Its preamble renounced war and pledged the nation to justice and order among nations. Article 9 forbade the maintenance of aggressive forces. Behind its legal phrasing lay the memory of what lawlessness had wrought. The occupation government distributed pamphlets explaining the Geneva Convention to schools and police academies. Children who had been taught to die for the emperor now studied humanitarian codes. Meanwhile, the Allies reviewed the wartime record to strengthen those same codes. Delegates from dozens of nations met in Geneva again, studying testimonies from across the globe. Among the documents were depositions by American officers who had run Japanese POW camps. They described how clear rules had prevented chaos and revenge. Their evidence helped shape the 1949 Geneva Conventions, expanding protections to civilians and medical personnel. The suffering of the Pacific had become a foundation for global reform. For former prisoners, memory remained complex. Many carried guilt rather than gratitude. They felt unworthy of mercy when others had perished by their command. Some visited shrines, leaving behind their military insignia as penance. Others wrote letters of apology to the families of Allied soldiers. A few became outspoken advocates for peace, warning new generations that strength without law is ruin. In small, unremarkable acts, a salute returned, a handshake offered. The great reversal of the Pacific War found its quiet closure. The men who had mocked mercy were alive because it endured. By 1949, Japan was no longer a defeated foe, but a nation under reconstruction. American engineers repaired railways. Japanese students learned English and constitutional law. Factories reopened under civilian control. The occupation transformed from punishment to partnership. What began as conquest evolved into cooperation, a living proof that justice could outlast destruction. Among returning prisoners, reflections grew more candid. Some admitted that they had feared annihilation once captured, but found instead the strange stability of rules. One lieutenant wrote in his memoir, "When I was treated fairly, I understood for the first time that freedom is not chaos. It is order freely chosen." American policymakers, too, drew lessons. They realized that humane treatment of prisoners had not weakened the Allied cause. It had strengthened it. When reports of camp discipline reached the world press, they bolstered U.S. credibility during early post-war diplomacy. In the Cold War years that followed, the memory of lawful victory became part of America's moral arsenal. In Tokyo, the last major trials closed that same year. Some sentences were commuted, others carried out quietly. But the spectacle had already ended. What remained was reflection. Japanese jurists studying international law concluded that the Geneva system was not Western sentimentalism, but the very framework of modern civilization. They began translating the conventions into Japanese, teaching them at universities where, before the war, military doctrine had dominated. The paradox became part of national memory. Those who once equated mercy with disgrace now saw it as civilization's backbone. In film and literature, the theme appeared repeatedly. The soldier who learns that compassion survives defeat. Veterans wrote to American former guards, thanking them for discipline rather than kindness. The gratitude was quiet, but real. In 1949, when the new Geneva Conventions were signed, Japan was not yet a member of the international community, but its future signature was already expected. The world had seen its metamorphosis, from a nation that mocked the law to one rebuilt under its protection. For the generation that lived through both captivity and reconstruction, the final lesson was personal. Strength had failed them, only order and mercy had endured. The empire of the sword had perished, and in its ashes stood a republic of law. A decade after Pearl Harbor, Japan's streets bustled again with life. Neon lights replaced bombed ruins, and children played where air raid shelters once stood. The men who had commanded armies now grew old in modest homes, their uniforms folded away, their memories uneasy. In interviews recorded during the 1960s, several reflected on the irony that had haunted them since surrender. "I believed the Americans were decadent," said a former naval commander. "I laughed at their laws. But it was their laws that fed me." Another, once a prison warden in Singapore, recalled seeing Allied judges in Tokyo bow to defendants before sentencing them. "I understood then," he said, "that civilization had survived, and I was part of it only because my enemy believed in mercy." The story of the Pacific War did not end with explosions or treaties. It ended in quiet acts of restraint. Meals served to prisoners, documents translated, trials conducted with decorum. Those gestures, repeated thousands of times, rebuilt a world that had almost destroyed itself. Historians later argued that the real victory of 1945 was moral rather than military. The atomic bomb ended the fighting. The Geneva Principles preserved humanity. Without them, post-war reconciliation would have been impossible. Because America upheld law in victory, Japan could accept defeat without annihilation. Because Japanese soldiers experienced mercy, they could imagine peace. The 1949 Geneva Conventions became the cornerstone of international conduct. Every war since has invoked them, sometimes honored, sometimes violated, but never forgotten. Their endurance is the quiet echo of that Pacific reversal. In Tokyo's Yasukuni Shrine, among the tablets of the dead, visitors still find offerings from former prisoners. Small cards written in careful brushstrokes read, "Forgive us." They are not requests for pardon from others, but reminders to themselves that humanity, once denied, must be earned again and again. Near the end of his life, an aging American camp commander was asked whether treating the Japanese humanely had ever felt unjust to the men who suffered under them. He paused before answering. "Justice is what we gave them," he said. "Mercy is what kept us human." That sentence could stand as the final line of the war's hidden history. The Japanese commanders who mocked America's POW laws lived to see those same laws define their fate. They had built an empire upon the sword. It collapsed under the weight of its own contempt for compassion, and from the ruins rose an enduring truth, that strength governed by mercy is stronger than strength alone.